How's it going, guy? How you doing?
Good, David. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, no worries. So I guess with the Vita Sapien, what is the kind of mission behind it that you're hoping to achieve with it?
Yeah, okay. So the organization is called Vita Sapien, which is a fancy way of saying life
Hmm?
wise. I'm an environmental
Yeah,
scientist, and over the last 20 years, I spent most of my waking hours trying to puzzle out why it was that the humans have allowed the governments and industry to collude together and basically create this climate change problem by belching 40 billion tons a year of greenhouse gases that accumulate in the atmosphere and heat the planet and is basically sending
yeah,
us towards oblivion. That and the other big problem is the ecosystems that we're damaging the forests and the ocean and so forth. Those two big problems are called
mm,
the climate and ecological crisis. The term I use is Anthropocene
yeah,
crisis. We can talk endlessly about this. So, what I realized just 9 years ago actually was that the root of the problem is not what people know,
mm,
it's what people believe. And not because ultimately what people
okay,
know doesn't really motivate behavior. What we believe motivates behavior. So I started looking around to try and understand what
yeah,
it is that Western people believe. And you're in the realm now of religion and spirituality and ideology, beliefs, and
mm,
ultimately this big overarching term called worldview. And if your worldview,
yeah,
broadly speaking, that's at the heart of the problem is that the worldview of most people in the West, I'm only focused on the West, is
mm,
environmentally unsustainable because they believe in
yeah,
Christian mythology or they're into New Age spirituality or they've got hooked into like right-wing politics and so forth. So what I set out to do
mm,
is to basically write down a worldview, a way of seeing the world that if enough people took it on board, gives the humans the best chance of actually surviving this century, okay, and then actually thriving
mm,
thereafter. Right now, if you were to take a
yeah,
look at, you get your head around the climate and ecological data from the scientists who monitor and measure these things, we're in dire straits and it's getting worse every day. So we need some sort of a
mm,
global mass movement, and it has to be founded around spirituality because it's spirituality which is the motivator
mm,
of human behavior, not just knowledge. And so it's basically
yeah,
a ecologically sustainable spiritual philosophy that I'm putting forward as a solution to the climate and ecological crisis. And I think that if we can get that out to the
mm,
53 million people who already broadly think this way, I refer to them as latent Vitans. If we can reach out to the
mm,
53 million latent Vitans, not only do we have a powerful fighting force to do the work that's necessary to fix the crisis, but we've also got a potentially a very, very big business because the 53
yeah,
million people will be buying goods and services as a part of their way of expressing their interest in the
mm,
philosophy. That's the game that I'm playing.
yeah. And I guess why is it more important to you? Because obviously you're not making money from it yet, but like, why is it so important to you?
Well, basically, I came to the conclusion at the age of about 35
Mm,
through a friend of mine who was always busy doing little business enterprises. His name was Peter Brown. He passed away a few years ago. He's a dear friend of mine. He was into mining. He had no interest in
mm,
environment and climate. But I got from him that in your life, you can actually pursue a mission, right?
yeah,
His mission was like mining services, and he was fitting out his truck with these cables and things, right?
mm,
And I realized also that, so I wanted to have a mission. I also
yeah,
realized the scale of this global crisis required some new thinking.
mm,
There were things that hadn't been thought up. And I also realized that if you're going to have a project, you put as much effort into a small project as a big project. So when you put these
yeah,
things together, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, I am looking for a project that can actually resolve the world's primary, the biggest threat to
mm,
humanity since humans evolved 300,000 years ago is this climate and
yeah,
ecological crisis. Okay, so I was looking out for a solution that nobody had come across, and then I kind of stumbled across it 9 years
mm.
ago. And what happened was, let me tell you that story because it's interesting. I realized that, back to this worldview thing, back then I sort of saw it framed around religion that 5 out of 8 people on the planet
Mm.
follow an unsustainable religion. Okay. And so I thought, well, what we need is a sustainable
Okay.
religion. So I went through that process and we actually got one. But then what I realized was that religious people
Mm.
aren't looking for a new religion, and non-religious people didn't want one in the first place. So that
Yeah.
wasn't the right answer. So after 2 years of sort of struggling with
Yeah.
that, I understood it was this broader idea around worldview, and that's where we shifted our focus. The philosophy, Vita
Okay.
Sapien philosophy,
Mm.
is now written. It's now written. It was meant to be a philosophy that continued to grow over time. So it wasn't supposed to
Mm.
be like a book that was written and never changed, which
Yeah.
is sort of one of the problems with a lot of the philosophies is that they were written 3,000 years and they haven't been updated because they're not updatable.
Yeah.
And so the philosophy is written. So we've gone through that's been over the last 5 years in which I've been living on a shoestring budget and happily to do so.
Yeah.
But the whole point of this 5 years was to get to the point that we're actually now ready to actually start getting properly resourced to actually expand rapidly and
Mm.
start telling the story around the world and reaching out to 53 million people.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And what's the main avenue you're gonna get to reach 53 million? Because that's a lot of people.
Yeah, so ultimately it's a communications game. So what we
Mm.
need is to ramp up our communications. So
Yeah.
social media is an important part of that. We've also established relationships with the United Nations so we can get to some pretty hefty UN events which are focused
Mm.
around the environment. So for example, we've got a pathway to get to the climate COPs. And
Yep.
just back to that 53 million. So the 53 million people, we call them the latent Vitans. Vitans are people who have a love and reverence for nature, whether they call that spiritual or
Mm.
not. They have they
Okay.
trust science and they are in action to make things better. So, like your environmental movement, basically, right? So,
Yeah.
we think there's around
Yep.
8% of Western adults are already in that space that will love the work that we're doing. That's the 53 million. And if you were to walk
Mm.
along the high street, an average high street, you'd be talking to 8 out of 100 people that would buy into this message.
Mm.
Where if you go to a
Yeah.
climate COP, which is the big international agreements where the environment ministers come to talk about climate change, and tens of thousands of civil society groups and charities are there.
Mm.
Like 95% of those people are vegans, and it's
Yeah.
all. So we've got the mechanisms in place now to go to the climate COPs and to actually share our literature, give away our books, and start enrolling
Yeah.
people there. Okay, now all of this, okay, and then of
Mm.
course there's social media, and then of
Yeah.
course we produce the books, and then of course there's mass media, which you can get into if you've got professional publicists and people working with you. So that's
Yep.
basically the game. It's simply a matter of sharing the philosophy, and then there's
Yeah.
all of the other stuff. There's like lectures and podcasts. There's new books under different themes. There's the range of
Mm.
jewelry. So once
Yeah.
we got the resources in that we can actually tool up, right? Then we can actually start enrolling the people. And once these people are
Mm.
enrolled, then we actually start to find there's an economic transfers, and then the organization's basically growing on its own. All
Yeah.
right. And just if I can just give you a sort of a bit of a sense of the scale of where this is going.
Mm.
The way I see it, at the moment, we have a registered charity, which is kind of like the flagship of
Yeah.
what will eventually be a flotilla of other institutions, whether they be other charities, trusts, for-profit companies, B Corps, social enterprises. Say 10 years from now, I can see probably half a dozen different institutions or organizations that are all part of the broader Vita Sapien organization. The Vita Sapien
Yeah.
charity that I'm now running is not the millionaire's factory. Nobody's going to get rich from Vita Sapien charity because that's not the role of charities and
Mm.
that's not what they're for. But if we can enroll out
Yeah.
the 53 million people, we can create these little satellite enterprises. For example, find some investment capital, for example, to tool up to mass produce the jewelry line. Okay. And
Yeah.
it's in those little satellite institutions that people can make money if they're interested in the investment into like these enterprises. And then
Yeah.
of course those enterprises will be feeding money back into the charity to allow us to continue to expand. the
Mm.
mission that we're on, the mission that we are on, what we are actually in the process of doing is
Mm.
resolving the climate and ecological crisis in a single generation. Now, at the
Yeah.
moment, we've got by on smell of an oily rag because we didn't really need that much money because we're in the writing phase. But now that we're
Mm.
in the phase to actually start spreading out, now we need to be properly funded. And properly
Yeah.
funded can be sort of viewed in a couple of different ways. I just want to share like this idea, this sort of spectrum. On one hand,
Mm.
if we've got 53 million people to enroll, in a
Yeah.
normal sort of business enterprise, you might see that there's a dollar cost to enrolling each of those people. So
Yeah.
let's say hypothetically, we have a mechanism and it costs us $10 to enroll each of those people, then we need
Yeah.
$500 million. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
once we
Yeah.
start enrolling those people and there's an exchange of goods and services, then we'd actually be able to fund that ourselves. So maybe we don't need $500 million. Maybe we only need $250 million.
Mm.
So let's just use that as a sort of a waypoint over here of how much funding we need to do our work, right? I'll give you another waypoint, which is
Yeah.
$100 million. Okay. So let me just explain what
Mm.
that gets you. Back in the year 2000, Shell Oil Company executives were sitting around and they were getting hammered from all different directions because the public was saying, you guys
Mm.
are, lobbying the governments, overwhelming our governance systems. We're stuck with fossil fuels
Mm.
because you guys are polluting the air with this false information about climate change, and you've got a hands all over our governments. And the BP oil company was like, well, this is too much. We're not going to stop doing that. So they went to Ogilvy Mayer, which is a big international ad agency,
Mm.
and said to them, what can you do to help us? They got their creatives working on it, and they came up with a 100 million US dollar advertising campaign to promote this thing called the carbon footprint calculator. And
Yeah.
what the ad company did was they basically convinced the public that it was their fault for climate change and you should just leave the oil company alone. So
Yeah.
I tell you that story to say, imagine if we had a $100 million advertising campaign with
Mm.
that same level of brains behind it to convince people that they need to fall in love with nature because we're destroying it and it's our last support system.
Yeah. And just
Okay.
to shift their belief. And that makes a lot of sense.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what it's about. It's about shifting the belief. We're not saying you should give up being a Christian or give up
Mm.
being in New Age spirituality or give up what you've got. But what we want is that you have the belief in the beauty and wonder of nature, okay, at
Yeah.
the heart of your spirituality, okay,
Yeah.
and that then motivates you. It gives you what's called moral concern, and when you have moral
Mm.
concern, then you take action to protect nature. And if we get enough
Yeah.
people doing that, we get to fix the problem because we got enough people puzzling it out and figuring out what we need to do to actually fix it. Okay, so just back
Yeah.
to the funding that we need. Another way of looking at the funding
Mm.
is because we're getting by on the smell of an oily rag, $1,000 would go a really long way at the moment in terms of giving us
Yeah.
new equipment, paying for a larger shed for our mega studio, and so forth. So on one hand, we want quarter of a billion
Mm.
dollars, and on the other hand, we'd be very grateful for $1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess that's the short term. You want 1,000, but because you have such a huge mission,
yeah,
most people don't even think that far ahead.
yeah.
So
Well,
that's pretty amazing.
and
But
look,
I guess,
go
what,
on, sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
No, so
Well, I
finish.
just want to understand more about. I want to understand more about what can someone do like individually, that are simple steps to like
Well,
have a sustainable life view.
yeah. So the first thing is to just engage with the brand, by which I mean go to the website, have a look at
Yeah.
it. There's we've got two primary websites. One is vitasapien.org.
Mm.
And we also have vitatv.org. I'll explain that in a minute.
Yeah.
So that on vitasapien.org, there is the philosophy is written down in a little book.
Mm.
Oh, hang on, stand by. Should have prepared this earlier. There you go. Got one here. So that's the
Oh yeah,
little pocket
nice.
book, right?
Yeah.
It takes about an if you can read a Harry Potter book.
Oh,
When I go
it's
like that.
blending into the background.
Yeah, I just disappeared into the ocean. If you can read a Harry Potter book, you can read
Yeah.
Vita Worldview. So this is the introduction to the philosophy.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And And then there is lots of interviews like this. So we have a YouTube channel, Vita Sapien YouTube.
Mm.
But if you go to vitatv.org, what we have there is basically a
Mm.
24-hour a day live stream of the YouTube videos
Yeah.
that we put together. And that includes some sort of meditative things with, like I go to waterfalls and down to the beach where the waves are rolling on the beach. And we just like film that for 5 minutes. Again, we're trying to get people
Yeah.
to engage with with nature through not only their rational minds, through the environmental science part of this,
Mm.
but also spiritually and emotionally. So some of the content on Vita TV
Yeah.
is to do with, it's sort of like meditations, if you like. I call them Vita Vistas. So that's how you'll get involved in Vita. That's how you would start. And then, of course, if you're passionate about the idea, then what we're looking for is for
Yeah.
people to put their hand up to create what we call pods. And a pod is basically where somebody grabs a couple of copies of the pocketbook and then basically
Mm.
invites people around, probably starting on a moon party. That's one of our events, is that we host parties on full moons and we watch the moon rise and we sort of talk Vita themes. And so anybody can basically create a pod. And a pod is basically you grab the book,
Yeah.
get your head around it, contact me. I'll be happy to talk, in person or over the internet, whatever. And then basically just start getting
Mm.
people involved. And the more people can get involved in the movement, the faster we can actually get this thing resolved because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Most organizations that have anything like
Yeah.
spiritual bent typically just grow very slowly and organically. We are pushing up against
Yeah.
biophysical limits of the tolerance of this planet. So if this thing is to work, it needs to
Mm.
grow extremely rapidly. And I'm up for that. That's the game that I'm playing.
Yeah. Yeah, because I guess most businesses have like fake urgency or like deadlines and all of that. But you actually have a real thing that if you don't fix this, then it's not going to work. And
Yeah, and
the world, yeah, it's not going to be good.
and if like I'm deep in the weeds on the climate science. I talk to leading climate scientists.
Mm.
I've got the interviews with
Yeah.
them on my on the Vita TV and on the YouTube channels, right? So when you actually talk to the guys that are on the front line that have spent their whole life doing science, like for example, I was watching one of the interviews I did with
Mm.
Peter Wadhams, who's an old guy who he's in his later years, but he spent like
Yeah.
the last 40 years in Greenland measuring the ice and figuring things out.
Yeah.
And he's freaking out, right? He's freaking out.
Mm.
One of the things he says up in the
Yeah.
Arctic there is underneath the sea, the East Siberian Arctic Ocean, Arctic Shelf, ESAS, there's like the water,
Mm.
say maybe 100 meters deep, but on the seafloor, there's kilometers deep of this material called methane hydrate, which is basically ice that's got methane enmeshed into it. And
Yeah.
as the Arctic Ocean is getting warmer because of climate change, um, these methanes are leaking out, and that methane is a
Mm.
powerful greenhouse gas, so it's a positive feedback. Okay,
Yeah.
and you talk to people across a whole bunch of different fields in the environmental sciences, and they're all freaking out because
Mm.
whilst all of this is going on, the global economy continues to grow at 2 or 3% per annum, which means it doubles in size every 25 years, right?
Yeah.
So we're in the steep part of the exponential curve, and this is why everyone's freaking out. This is why Vita Sapien needs to get properly funded ASAP and grow rapidly. And obviously, we'll need to bring in all manner of professionals and proper people.
Yeah.
I mean, people on the board as well as the professionals working in the organization. But that's the game that we're playing.
Yeah. That makes sense. What was it? You said, I forgot what you said, but you said something like the scientists are actually scared. But why do you think that, I guess, people like don't believe in what you're believing right now? People aren't taking action on that, and they might know climate change is a thing, but they're not doing anything about it, like aside from the oil company that you mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can answer that very directly. So
Mm.
if we just focus, say, on say American Christians, they're in the news. I don't know if you've followed the news in the last week, but the word
Mm.
went round that the rapture's on. Okay. So the
Mm.
rapture is one of these, it's a belief in some for some Christians that Jesus is going to come back. And when he
Oh,
comes back, he's
yeah,
going to lift all of the good Christians up to heaven with him. And everyone that gets left behind is going to go into the tribulation, which is like the end of the world and the planet burns, right? So
yeah,
for a significant proportion, this is primarily American. I was involved in a Christian group when I was 17 for about 10 months that were teaching this method. All right. And they're saying, don't worry about saving the planet. It's all going to burn anyway. So there is a significant proportion of the public in Western countries
yeah,
who actually believe that it's the will of the supreme creator of the entire universe that
yeah,
made the planet in the first place, that it's all going to burn. That's a big chunk of people that aren't taking action to make things better. Okay.
yeah,
If you look at another sector of our society, those people
yeah,
who are participants in New Age spirituality, well, New Age spirituality has got this fundamental schism between what they believe and science. There's no science to be had in that
yeah,
space. Okay, you don't go looking for the evidence that crystals connect you to your ancient, ancestors. You just
yeah,
accept it blindly. So that's another big chunk of the population. I actually took one of my climate change books to a crystal shop because it had like these spiritual themes in it. And they
yeah,
said, no, 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 we don't do climate change here. We do New Age spirituality. So there's
yeah,
that. Okay. And then,
yeah,
of course, you've got a big sector of the population who have bought into like right wing politics
mm,
that are funded largely by fossil fuel interests who
yeah,
just poo poo. They'll accept every other branch of science, but when it comes to climate science, they'll go, no, 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 that's a Chinese hoax. I mean, Trump was in the in the UN
mm,
saying exactly that just 2 days ago. So when you actually sort of map out, across Western civilization, and then you look down at all of the adults, and then you
mm,
start looking at what proportion of the adults are actually smart enough and caring enough to be engaged in trying to resolve this fundamental existential crisis. It's a
yeah,
very, very small population. And
mm,
within that population, amongst the environmental movement, there is actually quite a lot of misinformation. I was talking to somebody
yeah,
recently who actually had two PhDs in sustainability,
mm,
and she says, "Well, there's always other planets that we can go to," and I'm like, "No, there ain't other planets that we can go to." Right? We are not going to solve any of the world's problems
mm,
by putting anybody on Mars. Right? Mars on the best day is
yeah,
100 times worse than Earth was on its worst day. Okay, just to be clear. Okay, and then the closest other planet that might be
yeah,
within a what's called a habitable zone, which it might have close enough to the sun and not too far that it can have
yeah,
water, is 4.2 light years away. Okay, so if you
yeah,
traveled at the speed of light, it would take you 4.2 years to get there. If you traveled at the speed of the fastest ever spacecraft, it would take you around 80,000 years to get there and go, hey, this place is great. Come on over. It'll
yeah,
take 4 years for the signal to come back, by which time we're 80,000 years down the track where we've either resolved this crisis or we've all
mm,
perished, and it's looking more like we're all going to perish at the moment,
yeah,
absent some sort of a global spiritual movement that connects us to nature. Now, whether that's Vita Sapien or somebody else with the same idea under a different brand,
mm,
I don't much care. I want people to look at Vita Sapien, copy all the material, change the names and the words, and put out their own version of it because
yeah,
I really want this problem fixed.
yeah. And I guess there's been misinformation as well, like people saying, like I've heard, like, oh, the world's gonna end, 20 years from climate change, and then they say 10 years, but then we don't know what's happening, and then climate change is not real, or it is real, it's happening in 5 years.
Yeah.
Like, can you pull me up to speed on what's actually happening?
Okay. So when if you I get my information from scientists,
Yeah,
and scientists communicate through science papers.
yeah,
Okay, so they write papers, they do research papers. Okay, and then they put the papers out. Now, quite often the papers are very technical and dense because it covers lots and lots and lots of different
yeah,
ground. But then there is a class of journalists who are reputable science journalists who will read the paper, get their head around it, and then translate that into sort of common speak. Okay, there's a guy called Paul Beckwith, who's an associate
yeah,
of mine, who takes these papers and then basically pulls them apart and does YouTube videos to help you get your head around them. Okay, so if you get your source from there, you'll find that there is a very
right,
common thread and
Yeah.
it's not all over the place like you're describing. If you get your climate change news from particularly from right-wing news, it's always played down. It's not an issue, it's a hoax, don't worry about it.
Mm.
Oh, it used to be getting hotter, then it stopped getting hotter, and then they stopped
Yeah.
calling it global warming, they called it climate change. This is all just nonsense. Okay.
Yeah.
What's basically going on is that when we put the greenhouse gases represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the air in the atmosphere. For
Yeah.
example, CO2, which is the one that is doing most of the heating, okay, is around about 4 parts in 10,000. It's a tiny fraction, okay, but that tiny fraction is all you need to actually warm the planet up, okay.
Yeah.
And what happens is the sunlight comes down, it warms the planet, and then naturally the warmth radiates back into space. So the energy comes in, the energy goes out. The greenhouse gases trap some of that energy and help to distribute heat around the planet, which
Mm.
explains why it can be warm at night, because the space is like minus 270 degrees Celsius, but it's the gases in the atmosphere that are trapping the
Okay.
heat. If you add too much of that greenhouse gas, it gets too hot. And if it
Yeah.
gets too hot, then living things start to perish. Okay. So what we saw in an event called the Permian extinction
Mm.
253 million years ago, obviously we weren't here to see it, right? But the scientists have got all of these tools to understand what happened back then. There were these massive volcanic eruptions that
Yeah.
released vast amounts of CO2 predominantly, but also methane. These went on for around 300,000 years. And in that time, all of the natural systems, which are basically help to maintain the temperature of the planet, this is what nature does, this is called Gaia theory,
Yeah.
kept on top of it. But then what happened was there was these huge lava plumes that hit these coal fields, and then the greenhouse gases went boom, temperatures went way up. The
Mm.
ocean became acidic because a lot of that CO2 absorbs into the ocean to create carbonic acid. And basically 90% of everything that was living on the planet died off. All
Yeah.
right. Once the fires went out and everything got back together and the forest started to grow back again and pull carbon out the atmosphere, 10 million years later, we were back to business. There was lots of animals and plants and it was back,
Okay.
business again. We're doing exactly the same thing. We're
Yeah.
just doing it about 10 times faster than the Permian extinction. And this is the point that we're trying to get people to get their head around, is that this we're in the exponential phase now. And that in an exponential curve, as they call it, it's very flat to a certain point and then it goes up very sharply. We're entering
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
part now. And so we're out of time. And really we need something in the order of 50 years, maybe 80, 100 years to do a proper energy transition, to transition away from fossil fuels and into clean energy. And
Yeah.
despite all of the hype about it, clean energy it's got problems. It's
Mm.
imperfect, but compared to fossil fuels and climate change, it's an absolute godsend. I don't normally use that expression, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But also what we have to do is become much more disciplined in the use of energy so we
Mm.
don't have to use so much in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess with the 100 years, like what's something like what happens if we don't do anything about this for like 30 years? Like, is there something that's going to happen that will drastically change
Well, we're,
the
we're
World Sea?
let me explain one little idea,
Mm.
right? So multi breadbasket failure, that's the term they use. Okay. So as we heat the planet, right, the
Yeah.
big global weather systems, right, that distribute rain and heat and blah blah, right, okay,
Mm.
are driven in large part by the temperature difference between the polar regions where it's cold and icy,
Yeah.
okay, and the equator where it's really warm and hot. Okay, as we heat the planet, the poles heat up faster. So what's happening is the temperature difference between the equator and the pole is getting smaller. The temperature difference is getting smaller. And
Yeah.
what that's doing is changing the jet stream. The polar jet stream is this band of very high velocity wind. It's traveling around 300 kilometers an hour in a big loop like that. And it basically keeps the cold up there and the cool down there.
Yeah.
As we're getting this change in these relative temperatures, the jet stream is starting to get these big loops in it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when the loops happen, these loops can actually sort of park up for weeks at a time. You can end up having basically what's called a heat dome, where you basically get this massive low high pressure or low pressure, I can't remember, weather system, and it basically does like a flash drought. If you get that sitting on top of, for example, North America, it could destroy a wheat
Yeah.
harvest. All right. And one of the science papers
Yeah.
is saying that these loops, there's actually a pattern with 5 or 7 loops that can actually park up and actually destroy 3 major grain growing regions of the planet and effectively collapse food production in the space of 3 months. Even if we don't have that particular
Yeah.
scenario, as temperatures keep going up and up and up, the infrastructure that we've built to grow food and transport food is coming under incredible stress. There's one paper saying that
Mm.
when by 2070, the conditions will be so intolerable in the center of China where they grow a lot of their food. There's something in the order of 600 million people will perish because it will simply be too hot to go outside. That's the world we're going into.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I've just described there is I could talk all day long about these scenarios and how they interact
Mm.
with the biosphere and the living planet. And for example, we've got this massive
Yeah.
heat wave in the North Atlantic right now. So that will be affecting the phytoplankton's growth. And the phytoplankton is the base of the marine food chain,
Mm.
which then relates to global fisheries. There's an upwelling current, which means deep water comes to the surface, bringing up lots of nutrient around Panama. That has just collapsed in the last week. So we're
Yeah.
seeing these things all over the place. We're seeing extreme weather events. We're seeing that there is not more cyclones, but of the cyclones, more of
Mm.
them are big, powerful ones. Okay, so we're already seeing the climate
Yeah.
has changed and continues to change. And if we continue to make it worse by adding 40 billion tons of greenhouse gas per annum, it's just going to blow out, right? And at some point, the system's going to collapse, the whole global
Yeah.
order, right? And that's what Vita Sapien's mission
Yeah.
is to fix. And that is what
Because
Vita
like even with
Sapien
me,
is fixing.
yeah. Because like even with me, like I don't know much about it, and those things you mentioned, I have no clue. So it's like
Yeah.
we need to get the message out to spread it to people so they can actually be aware of what's
Yeah.
actually happening and the
Yeah.
causes of it.
Yeah, yeah. And what one of the things this is important as well about Vita Sapien, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people go on the journey of becoming smart and learning this stuff themselves.
Yeah.
So on one hand, I'm very happy to, in the book there are some instructions that you should do this, you should do that. But what we're
Mm.
really trying to do is we're trying to get people to have a thirst and a quest for a deep understanding of this so that they
Yeah.
can figure it out for themselves and they can use their unique personality to find their niche in creating the solutions.
Yeah.
This is important stuff. I just want to reiterate this point is that, a lot of environmental groups will be, to do with plastic cleanups in the ocean or
Mm.
reducing energy demand in the home. And they'll give you like a list of 10 things you can do to be more eco-sustainable.
Yeah.
Yes, we can do that. We'll point you in the direction of that resource. What we really want is for you to develop a hunger to understand this and to understand it
Okay.
both rationally through the environmental science, but also understand it emotionally and spiritually, which will then give you that great motivation to actually get on board and to make the world a better place.
And how do you do it spiritually?
So in the little book, there's a section in here called
Mm.
spiritual view. So the thing
Yeah.
about spiritual, let's just talk about the origins of spiritual, right? So
Yeah.
um, prior to Homo sapiens, there was a hominid referred to as Homo heidelbergensis, long,
Yeah.
complicated names. Basically, uh, our species, Homo sapiens, and the Neanderthal
Mm.
evolved from heidelbergensis. If you
Yeah.
actually look at the tools that heidelbergensis was using, these are stone tools. We got evidence of them because they're left behind.
Mm.
We understand about them. Then when the Homo sapiens arrived on the scene, there was no real distinction in the tool use for several 100,000 years.
Yeah.
However, around 70,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, there was what's known as the cognitive revolution, where we see in the record there's this incredible explosion in innovation in the design and the complexity of the tools that were being used by the Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
Prior to that, they were simple. All of a sudden, overnight, bang, they're starting to get really sophisticated with tools.
Mm.
This is where you find the first evidence of archery. To actually build bows and arrows, very
Yeah.
complex for people of that time without machines, right?
Yeah.
But you also see in this, at the same time, you start to see cave art show up.
Mm.
Okay, so maybe once upon a time you might have seen a red hand put on a cave wall, and that was cave art. All of a
Mm.
sudden, you start to see these amazing caves just full of all these incredible animals and all of the fine detail, where they've got like this, well, almost a pictorial representation of these sacred animals around them.
Mm.
You also start to see the origin beginnings of personal jewelry. Okay, but
Yeah.
you also start to see funerary practice where humans are actually being buried with in certain positions with certain artifacts. So this cognitive revolution, it created this explosion of not only engineering, but also art and spirituality. These things are all interconnected and they come
Yeah.
from the same place. Okay. Around three and a half, two and a
Mm.
half thousand years ago, in a period called the Axial Age, this is when the origination of all of the world's major religions came from.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is where it started to get really weird. And one of the thinkers back in that time was Plato. And
Mm.
Plato went, no, 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 no. Here's reality over here, and
Yeah.
here's spirituality over here. These things have got nothing to do with each other. We live in this imperfect world, and all we can do is aspire to be in the spiritual world, which is perfect. And this
Yeah.
translates into the Christian mythology about dying and living in heaven for eternity with Jesus and all of
Mm.
that stuff. So we think that whole narrative is just completely wrong. And that we
Yeah.
see that spirituality, all human beings have spirituality in the same way as that all human beings have a sense of smell, for example. It's
Yeah.
a human trait. It's one of the things that makes us distinct from the Homo habilis and the other animals that we share the planet with.
Mm.
Okay, so when we start to look at spirituality, what you typically find is that people will get all woo-woo about it and say
Yeah.
that it's not understandable, you can't get your head around it, it's deeply personal, la 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 la. But if you actually approach it rationally and say, well, what the hell is this thing? Then what you realize is it's got like this four of the six kind of major themes. It's like an
Mm.
umbrella concept that shelters many themes. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of those core themes that you'll often hear is that spirituality is this idea of individuals seeing themselves as part of a bigger thing, which is where God,
Yeah.
church comes in. Okay. People have a similar feeling around football clubs. Okay. So they sort of
Mm.
view their team as having these sacred, almost supernatural values, and they identify their life is
Yeah.
improved by identifying as a part of that. So that's a part of spirituality. Okay. Another part is the
Mm.
answers to these big questions that science can't help us with. So if you want to know what the safe amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, go and talk to a scientist. But if you want to know where did we come from, what happens when we die, and why are we here,
Yeah.
that's not a science question, right? There's not really a rational way of coming to that, right?
Mm.
That's a spiritual question, right? So
Yeah.
there's different spiritual philosophies will answer those questions. There's also the concept of the inner self, which is this sort of personal reflections and your personal taste. These are aspects of spirituality and so forth. So when you sort of, and this is mapped out in the little book, okay, which you can't see, the little
Yeah.
book. Okay. So so what we're trying to do when we're trying to help people change their spirituality, the first thing we do is we have a conversation about
Mm.
spirituality and how spirituality change actually happens. And spirituality change kind of happens not all the time to everybody, but it's always happening somewhere. It's
Yeah.
what born again Christians are really good at when they meet you on the corner of the street and they say Jesus loves you, and you say, what's that all about? And they say, oh, God created you and you want to go to heaven, you've got to stop sinning and give us
Mm.
10% pre-tax income and blah blah. Okay, that's a journey into a forming a view of spirituality. That's a
Yeah.
form of spirituality change because it answers these big questions. It
Yeah.
gives you this big thing to be involved in and to identify with. You've also got within spirituality this concept of peak experience. And that's what
Mm.
you get when you sing in a crowd of people. That's why they have the happy clappers with the guitars, and they have like
Yeah.
those bands, is because you have this sense of like it's exciting, you get dopamine rush. That's peak experience. So if you look at the way that spiritual institutions manage these big things. What's the big thing where you want to be involved in? Well, that's God and the church. What's the answer to life? That's written in the
Mm.
Bible. Where do we get peak experience? Come along and listen to the band. Okay, so we can take
Yeah.
all of that knowledge, and just what's the environmentally sustainable version of that? And that's exactly
Yeah.
what Vita Sapien is about. And so one of the aspects of that, for example, is to go out into a place where it's really dark, like
Mm.
when away from the city, go outside
Yeah.
on a clear night and actually just go and watch, look at the stars. And
Yeah.
if you're in Brisbane, I'm in on the Sunshine Coast. You
Mm.
have to travel 3 hours from Brisbane to get into the full dark, either down to the southwest or to the northwest. Just the other day, in fact, last
Yeah.
weekend, I was at a place called Mount Barney, where we're planning an event called Cosmos Night,
Yeah.
where we will take people to go and see the stars. And there's a creek running there as well. And so the immersion
Mm.
in nature gives people this great sense of awe and wonder, and helps them
Yeah.
to say, I want to, the big thing for me is that. The answers
Yeah.
to life's question is looking after this. Where did that
Mm.
come from? We came from the same place as the trees and the bees and the whales and the snails, a long train of evolution going back 3.8 billion years.
Yeah.
What happens when we die? We go into the soil, and the minerals in our bodies become part of something else's body. These are
Yeah.
spiritual questions. These
Yeah.
are spiritual answers. Okay. And the distinction between the answers that you'll find in the Vita Sapien book and say the major religions is that these answers are grounded in reality. They're
Mm.
grounded in the feeling. They're grounded in our understanding that
Yeah.
for since spirituality arose 70,000 years ago, 96% of that time, the human experience of spirituality has been connected to the wildlife and to the forest and to the seasons and to the rivers
Yeah.
and the ocean. It's only in the last 3,000 years ago that we've invented all these crazy gods and new age spiritual beliefs.
Mm. Yeah, and you see it with so many different cultures, even if they're secluded, they're all about nature and the land and everything like that.
Yeah,
And and even with like if you're in Brisbane, most people are in major cities around the world,
yeah,
so they never actually get to see the sky
yeah,
without all the light pollution and all of that.
yeah.
And it's more of like a magical moment to see the sky without all the lights and the noise.
Oh, it's
And,
insane. I mean, I did
mm,
a sailing trip once. Used to have a 34-foot yacht, and I was came out of the Burnett River. So this is out of Bundaberg, and I was
yeah.
going north up the coast. And this is back 25, 30 years or something. And it was full dark, like no moon. And I had the
Yeah.
full star field. You could literally sense a three-dimensional you can sense the three-dimensionality of it and you feel it
Mm,
pulsing, right? And on that
yeah.
trip, I had a seabird, type of bird called a brown booby, which is quite a large bird. It's got a white belly, but a dark brown
Mm,
back. And there's a long pointed nose. You see when they dive from a great height, like a spear punching into the water. This booby came and sat on the bow of my boat, right?
yeah.
And it looked around, it got itself comfortable, it tucked its head under its wing and it went to sleep. And I was the guardian of this bird. It was the most
Mm,
magical experience, right? And that's raw nature, right?
yeah.
What we're doing through our societies and allowing these crazy politicians to collude with industry and have all this insane beliefs, about rapture events and the end times, right? We're destroying that beautiful and wonderful thing, and we don't
Mm,
have to. And I think it's a relatively simple, straightforward process to resolve this crisis.
yeah.
Is basically put the money and resources into institutions that can foster a global mass movement to spiritual awakening to nature.
Yeah. And and the fact that it's like so ingrained with who we are as humans, it's not something like with normal religions, it's something external, it feels like.
Yeah,
But with like Vita Sapien and all of this, it's the nature, the animals, the plants, all
yeah,
connected.
yeah,
And that's what most humans like love. And like even with you go outside, you love the nature, love the trees, love the animals. So I can see why it should be like a worldview, or it should be normal for every human to believe in it.
yes, yeah. And look, this is something that I think that the environmental movement has really failed to do is to
Mm.
help people connect spiritually to nature.
Yeah.
For sure they'll take you out. I'll give you an example. There are two places in Australia where you can
Mm.
actually hand feed wild dolphins. One of them's
Yeah.
like Moreton Bay, Tangalooma. The dolphins come in at dusk. And there is another place north, it's an hour and a half drive from Noosa, where I am, Tin Can Bay,
Yeah.
where the type of dolphin called Indo-Pacific humpbacks, about eight of them come in every morning at 7 o'clock to this beach and they get fish. When you listen to the people
Mm.
tell the story about the dolphins, it's very left brain. The dolphins grow for this long and they get to this size and then they do this and they do that. What they fail to say
Yeah.
is, guys, this is a portal into the beautiful, wonderful depths of Gaia, the living planet, through the feeding of the dolphins. This is a powerful spiritual experience to hand feed wild dolphins.
Mm.
But you got to kind of be told it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just think, oh, it's just another tourism venture, a bit like the slippery slide at Warner Brothers. You know what I'm saying? And so,
Yeah.
what I'm trying
Yeah.
to get to is that these experiences all around us, the full moon rises every 28 to 29 days. Okay. And that, if
Yeah.
you see that on a clear night, that is an awe-inspiring experience. There's a psychological condition called the moon illusion, where the moon appears to be much larger than it really is when it's on the horizon. It's a psychological optical illusion. And when people see a full moon rise, but you've
Yeah.
got to know where to look, and you've got to be on the right balcony, and ideally have your friends around you to share the experience. So when we have these moon parties, we know exactly where and when the moon's coming up. And in fact, here you go. One of the little hot tip from the Vita Sapiens is one of the really good places to watch the full moon rise is actually that bar in the Emporium Hotel on South Bank. There's a bar up the top there on the 21st floor with a big balcony. You go up there and you
Mm.
see the moonrise. It's absolutely awesome. And then you can go and buy a grossly overpriced glass of wine. Which has happened. So that's really back to that spiritual thing. That's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to help people connect into these little natural gifts, like the stars at night, but you got to plan for that. The moon
Mm.
rises, they got to plan for that. And
Yeah.
also tying that in with a deeper understanding of the science of it, because once upon a time, back when all of these crazy religions were written, okay, we didn't have satellites. We
Mm.
didn't have mathematics. We didn't have advanced math.
Yeah.
Know how things worked. You know, like the early
Mm.
science allowed us to do astronomy and understand the rotation, Newtonian motion, all that stuff. So when Cook
Mm.
went to one of the islands in, I think, Puerto Rico or somewhere in the Caribbean, and he wasn't welcomed by the
Yeah.
natives, he said, "Well, I'm going to turn the lights off on you guys. 4 weeks from now, the sun's going to go black." Well, he just happened to know astronomy. Okay, they didn't. So when the sun went back, when he came back a couple of weeks later, they're like, "Oh, come on in, mate. What do you want?" Thought he was godlike, right? So
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that when these religions were founded, we had
Mm.
no idea about anything. Okay,
Yeah.
and in addition to that, there was only around 300 million people on the planet at the time of, say, the Bible, right? When
Yeah.
the Bible was written. Okay, there's 8.3 billion people on the planet now, right?
Yeah.
There was the ecosystem was abundant back then. Now
Yeah.
it's scarce. And so that if nothing else, these are the reasons why these ancient religions are simply unable to help us address the climate and ecological crisis. And this is why we need a whole new refreshed thinking about the spiritual philosophy that we adopt as we go through our lives, whether you call that religion or you call that spiritual, or whether you're just more
Mm.
interested in the scientific aspects of it. The way that this little book is written, it caters for all of those different people.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, easy. Um, mm, I guess what's like a misunderstanding that most people have about climate change? Is it just that people don't think it's real? Is that the main thing?
Um,
Or
I
is it,
I
yeah,
think that there is actually a big debate in the environmental movement. This is so
mm,
ironic, but it's true. It's an ongoing debate as to whether we should actually tell the truth about climate change. Because when
yeah,
you actually get your head
oh,
around it and you talk to the scientists, right? It is
Yeah.
very, very grim, right?
Yeah.
It is very grim. Like what is come if we were to hypothetically stop burning fossil fuels overnight, let's just play a scenario, okay? Well, for one thing, it's going to take decades before the temperatures start to go down, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for another thing, if we stop burning fossil fuels overnight, the temperatures would actually shoot up immediately,
Yeah.
right? Because when we burn fossil fuels, particularly coal and particularly
Mm.
dirty coal, it puts out the CO2 gas, which is the gas that heats the planet, but it
Yeah.
also puts out little particles of sulfur, and the little particles of sulfur linger in the air and they reflect sunlight. It's
Yeah.
called global dimming. Okay. If you stop burning fossil fuels overnight, what happens is the global dimming goes away instantly within a week or so that the sulfur rains out, but the
Yeah.
CO2 persists. So what happens is you get your heating continues, but the cooling drops off within a week. And so what happens is the
Yeah.
temperatures go up. One of the reasons there's actually been a lot of science on this, the temperatures in the northern
Mm.
Atlantic have gone up significantly in the last couple of years. And one of the reasons for that is because the
Yeah.
International Maritime Organization, the UN body that looks after global shipping, has finally enforced rules to get sulfur out of the shipping fuel because sulfur, a lot of cheap fuels got sulfur in it and it leads to acid rain
Mm.
and all sorts of nasty problems. So they got the industry to get rid of the sulfur, but the sulfur was actually acting as a cooling agent. So as
Yeah.
soon as the ship's sailing backwards and forwards, they're not creating that blanket of reflective sulfur dioxide, and the temperatures went up.
Mm.
So I'm telling that story to say that if we were to get the Vita Sapien mass movement connecting people spiritually to nature, we
Yeah.
would be and we actually got all of the tools necessary to fix the problem. We got to have a really big think about how we fix the problem because
Yeah.
just turning off the generators overnight is going to exacerbate things. And this
Yeah.
is the concern: is that we've got a whole planet. We've got what 8 billion people. We've got a what is it, $17 trillion a year economy. It's this
Mm.
massive, complex, messy thing. And we got to try and transition to the sustainable version that will
Yeah.
allow us to live on this planet for a long time. But we got to figure out how to do it. And running
Mm.
interference are all the crazy Christians that are waiting for the rapture, or the right wing politicians that are completely wedded to the fossil fuels and so on. So we've got a major,
Mm.
major, major crisis. Even when we get
Yeah.
enough people on board, we've got a big challenge.
Yeah. Is it similar to like how like the reason you might not want to tell people is because they might freak out?
Yeah, that's the argument, is that if you tell people the
Yeah.
truth about this, and the other point about it is
Mm.
that we're going into hell irrespective of what we do. The question is whether we act fast enough that
Yeah.
we only go into the shallow part of hell and pop out the other side singed but otherwise intact, or we just keep delaying and go into the fiery pit. I don't like
Mm.
using hell references, but everybody knows what I mean by that. Okay. So whatever we
Yeah.
do, we are going we are
Um.
going we're in we're
Yeah.
going we are
Mm.
already in a collapse of our global ecosystem. Okay. So 5 and 10 years from now,
Yeah.
we will be in a very different world. The question is whether we're
Yeah.
addressing the issues or whether we're just exacerbating them, in which case it just keeps getting worse. And ultimately,
Mm.
one of the risks is that we lose that the human beings go extinct. Now, the
Yeah.
irony, of course, is if the human beings go extinct, and this is not some far out science fiction
Yeah.
theory. All you need to do is just keep pressuring global food production. We've got 17,000 nuclear weapons. There's
Mm.
450 nuclear power stations that need decades of engineering to stop them just burning up and
Yeah.
polluting the atmosphere with ionizing radiation. Okay, we've got hundreds of millions of tons of plastic floating around in the ocean that needs to
Mm.
be pulled out because it's breaking down and getting into every aspect of the food chain. The
Yeah.
microplastics are now in every human organ. They've done testing. They're finding microplastics inside sperm, right?
Yeah.
So we need to turn and start cleaning up the mess. And
Yeah.
one of the big opportunities that is outlined in this little book, this philosophy book, and this comes from a scientific understanding of how planets work and planetary habitable zones and so forth, is that this planet is good for life for another 2 billion years. Okay.
Yeah.
We've had life on this planet for about 3.8 billion years. It seems to have arisen naturally on its own when conditions allowed. So when the Earth first formed, it was very hot, lots of comets and nasty stuff happening. But when it cooled down and conditions were
Yeah.
right, then life naturally, spontaneously arises. When conditions are right, you can have the right chemical conditions, water, temperature, and so forth, right? So we've got
Yeah.
another 2 billion years ahead of us. Beyond that time, as the sun gets older, it'll eventually swell up. They swell up when they run out of fuel, ironically. Okay. And so about
Yeah.
around 2 billion years from now, the pretty much everything will be burnt off the planet. All right.
Yeah.
So that's our birthright to live into that time.
Mm.
And so we're not going to get 2 billion years. We're far too complex, and
Yeah.
large an organism. There might be things like bacteria living under the ground 2 billion years from now, but there won't be any mammals and big things
Mm.
walking around on the surface, right? So we can reasonably aspire to live on this planet for what's called a galactic year. So
Yeah.
a galactic year. So our solar system is basically kind of spinning. Well, the galaxy is spinning. Okay.
Mm.
And so we go around the core of the galaxy. Our solar system goes around the core of the galaxy once every 230 million years. That's called
Yeah.
a galactic year. So the aspiration of Vita Sapien is that the humans get to live on Earth for a galactic year. All right.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it starts to get really tricky because there's all sorts of other things that could do us in,
Mm.
to do with the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere being ripped out by rocks and complicated sciencey
Yeah.
stuff. So we probably won't get a billion, almost certainly not get a billion. But if we get our act together, we could
Yeah.
potentially still be here playing with the dolphins, all right, and the seabirds on the sailing boats
Yeah.
230 million years hence. Now, that is a vision. That is a
Mm.
vision to get behind. And that's Vita Sapien philosophy.
And I guess with the climate change and everything, can we stop it or do we just reduce the impact? Like, or can we even
Yeah.
reverse the impact of it?
All right. So there are three things that we need to do. Firstly, we've got to stop putting the fossil fuels in the air
Mm.
in the first place. That's the energy
Yeah.
transition. That's to do with transitioning to sustainable agriculture. That's to do with modifying, using different
Mm.
types of cements. A lot of greenhouse gas comes from cement. That's to
Yeah.
do with stop cutting down massive amounts of forest. Okay. So that's stop putting the carbon in the
Yeah.
atmosphere. And it's not just carbon, it's also methane, it's also nitrous oxide, and there's some others as well. But say carbon just to keep it simple. Second thing
Yeah.
we've got to do is we've got to pull some of the carbon out of the atmosphere that's already up there. Okay. So back before the Industrial Revolution, there was about 275 units up in the sky. That's 275 parts per million. Okay.
Yeah.
The maximum safe amount the scientists think is around 350, and we're at around about 430 now. So we're way above the maximum safe amount. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we have to do, this is big mission number two, is we need to pull a lot of that carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Now, one way of doing that is just leave the goddamn forests alone and let them grow back. Okay.
Yeah.
It's called rewilding. Okay. There's techniques we can use where we can foster the mass growth of phytoplankton in the ocean. These are the tiny plant plankton. So we can
Mm.
actually actively intervene to actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that broad field is called drawdown. It's about drawing down the carbon. The
Yeah.
third thing that we need to do is somehow deal with the fact that the planet is already hotter. There is far too much heat has already built up in the Earth system. Now, we don't have a way yet of actually accelerating getting the heat out of the Earth system,
Mm.
except for making sure that the massive forests are intact and healthy, because they actually
Yeah.
act as a big air conditioning system, pumping heat out of the Earth system, right? It's part of the natural temperature
Yeah.
regulation system of the planet. This is Gaia theory, right? Okay. And so there are some
Yeah.
plans to actually put sulfur compounds and stuff in the upper atmosphere that would help reflect sunlight, that would, instead of getting rid of heat, to actually reduce the amount of heat that's coming in. That stuff's really controversial and very
Yeah.
tricky. So these are the three big things that we
Mm.
need to do. The United Nations, in all
Yeah.
of its big climate talks, is only focused on the one. Okay. And it's not getting much traction there because, for example, 2 years ago, I was in Dubai at COP28. The COP is the conference of parties. It's the big gathering of environment ministers and charities and others. Well, 70,000 people went to Dubai to talk about climate change. Okay. It was an event. The president of that COP was an oil man. His day job was running an oil company, right? And he was in charge of
Yeah.
running the climate talks. So surprise, surprise, it was a big success, and they agreed to do practically nothing. Okay. So
Yeah.
this again back to the scale of what we've got to do to prevent the collapse and
Mm.
annihilation of life on Earth and the human race. It's this vast task, and we're not even really making a serious go of it yet. And this is the message, right?
Yeah.
This is the exciting journey to come on. Get your head around this and put your life into this because this battle will be going on long after I'm gone, right? I'll be walking around an old man tapping the boys on the backs as I go,
Yeah.
shuffle through the trenches. This is a multi-generation battle that's going on. Okay. But we've got to start it and we've
Yeah.
got to ramp it up really quickly because we are so out of time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Because we're not going to get that galactic year if we just keep doing nothing about it.
Beautiful. Exactly. Well, if we destroy the ecosystem and the humans go extinct, there's no more, right? And this is all playing out over
Yeah.
decades and a century or so. We could have practically no humans left. I am personally expecting, if I were a betting man, right, I would put money that we will
Mm.
lose a quarter of the world's
Yeah.
population in my lifetime, and I'm 58 years old. Okay. Where the global population is continuing to grow.
How though?
How? Because
Mm.
food production collapsed, right? Extreme weather events. Like I'm
Yeah.
saying, like 2070, the science paper was saying they could lose 600 million people in China because it's just too hot to go outside. You've got this. Let me explain this. There's this concept called wet bulb
Mm.
35. Okay. So, wet bulb 35 is this
Yeah.
idea that if you have 35 degrees Celsius and 100% humidity, imagine I'm in this little pod, right? Imagine it was like a sauna. Okay. Your body is basically, you're going to fry your internal organs and you'll die within 2 hours if you're at 35 cents Celsius
Mm.
and 100% humidity. If you have a higher temperature but a lower humidity, you got the same problem. There's like a little graph you can see. And so what's basically happening is that as the temperatures are going up, there is more evaporation because as the global average temperature increases, there is more water vapor in the atmosphere. You
Mm.
get more humidity. There are places around the world that are starting to show these wet bulb 35 temperatures. Okay. And in those situations, you get lots and lots of people just die because it's too hot. Particularly, say, for example, in India, they have these really savage heat waves. A lot of people over there are still agrarian. They're working outside with hose and doing farming work. And it gets so hot. And that, unless you can get into an air conditioned space, you're just going to die. All right. So, as the planet gets
Mm.
hotter, these zones where the heat is deadly just keep spreading and spreading and spreading. And it's not only are they
Mm.
spreading deadly to humans, they're deadly to grain, right? And grain is at the very
Yeah.
foundation of civilization because you can store it and you can transport it. But grain doesn't grow when it gets too hot. So we're going into this place
Mm.
now. Listen to Peter Kalmus. He's one of the climate scientists that talks freely. He works
Yeah.
with NASA in their climate science division. His house got burnt to the ground. He left the house 2 years before. He was living
Mm.
in Los Angeles, where they had those massive fires about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
One of the suburbs that got completely annihilated. That's where he used to live. And he says every day he expects to see some sort of a heat wave that kills 1 million people. And it's
Yeah.
coming. And here's one of the other ironies. One of the other things that keels over during heat waves is fossil fuel powered energy generators because they create lots of heat that they've got to dump. And when you get
Yeah.
a heat wave, quite often your coal fired power stations and your gas fired power stations will trip out. And these are the things that are running the air conditioners that are stopping people from dying. All
Yeah.
right. There's a novel called Ministry of the Future by
Mm.
Kim Stanley Robinson. And the opening sequence of that book is all about climate stuff. Is a heat wave that kills 20 million people in India. That's the opening sequence of the book. That's
Yeah.
the world. I'd say that's not. I'm not saying that's the world we're going into. That's
Mm.
the world that we're in now. And
Yeah.
every year we put another 40 billion tons of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere to make it even worse.
Yeah. Yeah, because the cost of inaction and doing nothing is just so high, and you'll see the effects of it
Yeah. Yeah.
sooner rather than it's not like a century away. We'll see some effects. We'll
Well,
see it.
we're seeing it now. We're seeing it
Yeah.
now in these superstorms that we've always had storms, we've always had superstorms, right? But we
Yeah.
haven't necessarily had five in a row. You know,
Yeah.
the first coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef, if I'm correct, was around 1984. They probably happened in the past when conditions
Mm.
were just randomly particularly bad for one season. The first one since there's been really intense scientific study on the Great Barrier Reef, I believe was 1984. And the next one was something like 20 years later or 10 years later. And then the next one was five
Yeah.
years later. And now they're kind of happening back to back. And at some point,
Mm.
the reef won't be able to recover in between these heating events, and the whole thing will just
Yeah.
the reef will die. And what that means is the little coral polyps will die, and in their place there will be just green seaweed and all of that beautiful color and diversity. I don't know if you've ever been to the Great Barrier Reef. I actually worked on a commercial fishing boat for a couple of
Mm.
weeks out on the reef. Just absolutely mind blowing place. I mean, just insane. The
Yeah.
acropora, the blue stag coral, like 30 feet deep, crystal clear water, right? 30 feet deep, sandy bottom, and this staghorn coral with this
Mm.
bright blue and all these little tiny, absolutely magical. Well, that's all on its way out. It's going to turn
Yeah.
into seaweed. Okay. And so
Mm.
this is all playing out right now. This is all playing out
Yeah.
right now. And if all the governments in the world, right, got serious, okay, and really started working on this thing, that gives us a much better chance, but still not guaranteed because we've got this other problem is called the lag, which is
Mm.
basically that when you put the greenhouse gas in the air, right, it sort of takes decades for the heating to be felt. So if
Yeah.
we were to start retreating, like reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, it's the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are causing the problem, not the new
Mm.
stuff that goes up. It's the fact that there's
Yeah.
430 parts per million in the atmosphere. That's the radiative forcing. So if we stop putting the greenhouse gases up there, you
Mm.
still got the greenhouse gas problem,
Yeah.
right? Which means that we've then got to start pulling it down, and we just got to ramp up all of the systems that we know work. And we're
Yeah.
not doing that because we don't have an international price on carbon and we don't have like strong institutions. We got the UNFCCC, which is letting oil men run the
Mm.
climate talks. You know what I'm saying? We're in dire straits.
Yeah. And it's not like a country problem like India, Australia, America. It's all over the world. So we're all gonna see the effects of it,
Yeah.
whether it's now or
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah. And the really sad thing, the thing that if I were to shed a tear, apart from the seabirds being one of the victims, is that the poorest people in the world are the ones who do least to make the problem, right? The carbon footprint of people in African countries and
Mm.
South
Yeah.
Asia is minuscule. And yet they're the ones getting absolutely
Yeah.
hammered because they don't have the infrastructure in place. They
Yeah.
got shitty road systems, they've got dams that fail, they've got hospitals that aren't properly funded, right? So
Yeah.
this is a big global equity issue, and it comes again. I come back to this spiritual question about this whole thing. Who am I? What do I
Mm.
what am I doing here? Right? Am I somebody that wants to be a part of exacerbating this crisis that is going to annihilate our beautiful planet and our wonderful civilization? Or am I
Mm.
going to be somebody that says, I'm going to be a part of the living planet? I'm going to express myself through the love of Gaia. That's the term I use. That's a spiritual term to describe the living planet, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What sort of person are you? What are you going to pursue in your life? Are you going to try and spend your life to make enough money to live in a big house and drive the latest car and have the latest iPhone? Or are you going to spend your life trying to be one of the people that figures out how to actually get through this century and get into the verdant age in the future? This is the future time when humans and the planet live in balance and that we can then live out into hundreds of millions of years into the future. That's a
Mm.
spiritual question. And it's a
Yeah.
spiritual question that most people never have asked.
Mm. Yeah. And also the fact that you mentioned before, like people can have a worldview of like God and religion and Christianity, etc. Or they can just be like, this is my favorite football team, and if they win, I'm happy. And
Yeah.
so we could convert more of those people that have a, it's
Yeah.
not that it's a bad view, but it's just you
Yeah.
can shift it over to something that's more
Yeah.
sustainable.
Yeah,
So
that is exactly right. And the term that I use is augment. Okay. I don't say
mm,
change because people go, oh, I don't want to change. And I don't say shift. That's not the
yeah,
augment. The idea is that it's like it's sort of, I'm just trying to paint a little a little picture. You got all these sort of people sitting in the back in a bus, right? And all of a sudden somebody comes in wearing the green, and then there's
yeah,
another person wearing the green. It's just you augment it. And as you augment it, like I've got a friend of mine who's definitely a vegan, right? In that he definitely trusts science, he
yeah,
loves nature, and he's a man on fire. He's an ecological economist. His name is Andrew. Shout out to Andrew.
mm,
Andrew's always off at the football. And I go, what are you doing?
yeah,
I'm going to go and drink some beer. He said, no, 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 I'm going to the football. I'm like, what? I'm not saying that people shouldn't go to the football, right?
yeah,
What I'm saying is that the passion and energy that people put into the football, they need to put an equivalent amount of passion and energy into preventing the collapse of the global ecosystem, right?
yeah,
And go to the football. I'm not saying that Christians should stop being Christians. I have another friend, okay, who actually met through Andrew, whose name is Tim. Tim is like man on fire for forests. He's got a PhD in forest governance. He
yeah,
got hooked on forest when he was 8 years old because he used to have, this is in England, he used to have a forest at the end of this street that him and his
mm,
mates would go and they'd make forts and they'd fight battles, right, in amongst the trees and the right. He came home one day, there's all these vehicles had turned up. They plowed it down, turned it into a suburb, right? So he got
yeah,
hooked on forest governance, forest management, right, at the age of 8, whilst he was going to Sunday school. He's a
yeah,
vegan Christian, right? He keeps referring to the great koala in the sky. He uses these Christian metaphors in
yeah,
talking about protecting the forest. And the guy's like he's done the PhD, he's got the big brain, he sits down and he talks, uh, he writes the science papers and he talks to the ministers. And then during the day, he puts on his leggings so he doesn't get bitten by another snake. And he goes
mm,
out and he measures the trees to call the bluff of the forestry corporation that's knocking down these forests. So
yeah,
we're not trying to say to people stop being a Christian. We're saying if you're a Christian, be a Christian that loves the planet. And here's a frame of
yeah,
reference. Not everything in here is going to align with your biblical view of the world, but that's okay because one of the
mm,
strengths of Homo sapiens, us
yeah,
humans, is that we can commonly and frequently hold competing views on things.
mm,
We can believe two things that are contradictory.
yeah,
Okay, so you can
yeah,
read this and go, okay, I accept the evidence that life formed 3.8 billion years ago, and I still think that God created the world 6,000 years ago. You can do that, all right?
mm,
But what's important is not whether you're a Christian or not. What's important is whether you're in action to actually fix the planet.
yeah. And also aside from the worldview and everything, like having a bigger mission apart from yourself, it's also just going to help you as an individual. Like if you're going out there and seeing the moon and seeing the stars, you're more relaxed, you're more calm, less
Absolutely,
stress. It's going to
absolutely,
help at work.
yeah,
It's less about like a spiritual woo-woo thing. It's
yeah,
actually going to help you in day-to-day life,
yeah, absolutely,
regardless of what you
absolutely.
believe in.
Yeah, so in Japan, there's a concept called forest bathing. Well, you can do it anywhere, but in
Yeah.
Japan, there's like whole institutions set up to study it and to foster it. And basically, they lost a lot of their forests during the Second World War, but they
Mm.
had this big program to regrow, and they've got these really beautiful forests and national parks, and these places where you go and there's these walks and these guides and so forth. That will
Mm.
basically just have you walk in the forest. And
Yeah.
walking in the forest is this incredible de-stress. And
Yeah.
part of that goes back to there's a concept called biophilia, which is this idea that because humans evolved with all of the other animals, we evolved amongst forests. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of like it's comforting to us because it's
Mm.
ingrained in our DNA. It's ingrained in
Yeah.
our DNA that this is the place to be, and particularly adjacent to water. So this is why
Yeah.
people spend 20% more on a house if it's got a view of a river or the sea, right? It's ingrained in us. This is the
True.
biophilia theory. In addition to that, there's so much. quite apart from that spiritual aspect, as you're saying, there is these health benefits of being out in the forest and in nature places,
Yeah.
quite apart from anything else, because humans and our machines, okay, are heavily polluting. Like everywhere you go where there's motor cars, it's
Yeah.
belching out toxins out of the exhaust pipe. Mate,
Yeah.
I've just been notified that I've got to get out of this booth because they're closing the library.
No, you're good.
We're gonna have to. I'm gonna have to stop talking at this point. I'm afraid.
Yeah. No, no worries. What's your last message? Last message to everyone.
Just get involved. Just fall in love with the planet, and if please just fall in love with the planet and understand the planet through the environmental sciences and take action. And this is a pathway. There's lots of other pathways. I don't want to just tell you that this is the only way to do it. Okay, the game that I'm involved in is called ecosystem spirituality and environmental science and eco activism. We're trying to make that the main thing that people do. And if you fall in love with the living planet and you take the time to understand it and you visit it, and you develop moral concern for it, then you'll be one of the people who help to actually rescue our civilization from the biggest crisis that we've ever had.
Yeah. And where can people find you or Vita Sapien?
So Vita Sapien, VITA SAPIEN.org. So that's the main website. You can get the book there. There's Vita Sapien music. There's and also there's a link to Vita TV, which is Vita VITA TV.org. And so that's basically a 24/7 live stream of Vita content, which is basically a whole bunch of YouTubes and these like interviews like this one, interviews with
Mm.
scientists, music, little meditations, and so forth. So that's the pathway in. And if anybody's got resources that they can share, then we really need to grow. So let's have a conversation about that.